Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, Mexico 25, Navajo 1, Introduction to the Navajo. Last time we talked about some of the changes and challenges that were happening around New Mexico. This time we'll continue doing so by taking a closer look at one of the major players in New Mexico during the late colonial period, down to today, the Navajo. Being semi-nomadic, the history of the Navajo is hard to track at the early days and gets easier as we move forward. Their creation story has them traveling to the fifth world, this world, after trying to find a living in the rest. They emerge in the area of Diné Bikaya, traditionally bound by their four sacred mountains, Mount Taylor, Blanca Peak, the San Francisco Peaks, and Mount Hesperus. In addition, Huerafano and Gobernador Knob are also considered sacred mountains. The exact origins of the Navajo in the archaeological record are a little bit more difficult to track. Their language is Athabascan in origin, which means it shares roots with the Apaches and several indigenous groups found in Alaska and Canada. As far as actual physical remains, things have been found in the Southwest that date to as early as about 1100 AD, but there's very few remains left behind overall, and it's very possible they could have arrived earlier. DNA, the history of the Navajo, suggests that at least some of the people that now make up the Navajo may even have had their roots in the groups that made up Chaco Canyon and were either absorbed into or split off to form the Navajo after the post-Chaco collapse and kind of diaspora. Overall, most older histories portray the Navajos as little more than vagabonds who, upon arriving in the Southwest, had to be taught everything by the Pueblos, Spanish, and later the Americans or the Mexicans. In this portrayal, the Navajo have essentially no culture when they arrive and are given it to them by their neighbors. While to some degree there has been a large amount of cultural change when compared to their linguistic relatives, as Boyd observes, quote, Navajo cultural changes must have involved immigration, instruction, diffusion, and even local inspiration, sometimes under pressure of necessity, at other times perhaps more in response to opportunity, end quote. They continue on the Navajo adaptations overall. Quote, Old world peoples have left remarkably little that can be traced to their northern Athabascan ancestors, aside from language and basic cultural themes such as individualism, fear of the dead, high status for women, pragmatic and optimistic outlook, and, as a corollary to the last, flexibility in adapting to new situations, end quote. Another facet of this portrayal of the Navajo is that they were a static group of people until some outside force comes in and acts on them. But overall, this portrayal isn't really how societies behave. Few, if any, societies are completely self-contained and self-sufficient. They interact with their neighbors, at the very least for trade, and these interactions will change both sides of it. As a result, few, if any, societies remain the same over long periods of time. And most likely, the Navajo are no different. It's not like they're completely isolated from everyone around them until the Spanish decide to come and do something with them. And then the Navajo changed in response to that. Both sides of this interaction were interacting with each other and engaging in things that would have caused some of this cultural change. The Navajo also have a long history of incorporating new people into themselves. We've talked before about how many Puebloan exiles would leave to live among the Navajo or other groups on the fringes of the Spanish Empire after things like the Pueblo Revolt. A captive captured in a raid could also eventually be integrated into the greater cultural whole. Often a new clan would be created for these new integrated people. Probably the most striking cultural trait that the Navajo have is their ability to take new things and make them their own. Be this weaving or farming, which requires that they probably did get some help or learn from the Pueblos, or something more like silversmithing and livestock rearing. These things that the Spanish would have introduced and then the Navajo fully adapted into their own. Thanks to their limited cultural contact with the Spanish, at least when compared to other southwestern groups like the Pueblos, to some degree, the Navajo were able to pick and choose what they wanted out of things that the Spanish brought and incorporate them in fully. Probably the best example of this taking things from outside and incorporating it into the self is the word Navajo itself, which is really comes from a Tewa word, which is used to refer to a, quote, large area of cultivated land, end quote. The Navajo word for, the Navajo is Dine, which translates to the people. During the 1600s, the Navajo existed on the fringes of Spanish influence, being first mentioned by that name or one close enough to it in the mid-1630s. But like many semi-nomadic peoples of the Americas, tracking the Navajo can be fairly difficult. They're made up of many autonomous bands, and each of these bands mostly did their own thing, and the Spanish may have called one band one thing and another band something else, even if they would have been classified as Navajo by more modern observers. Sheep, obtained either from purchase, theft, or from some other means from the Spanish, would eventually become central to Navajo society. Eventually, it would come to be seen as a way of showing one's wealth. Not only could a sheep provide meat, it also provided wool, which could be used for clothing or fashioned into other trade goods. Add in a goat, and you now have goat's milk. A herd of sheep and goats are easily mobile and fit within the existing semi-nomadic lifestyle of the Navajo. Farming was a skill the Navajo would take to as well, tending to plots to help provide for trade or to help weather hard times when they arrived. But this was not focused agriculture. It was more setting up a plot, doing a little bit to make sure it's somewhat successful, but for the most part, it's on its own. Raiding also made up a huge part of the Navajo economy. If you want more sheep, a really easy way to do that without giving up things you have or things you may not have to trade is to just go steal it from either a New Mexican pueblo or from the Spanish themselves. This, of course, in turn led to the Spanish setting out to try and chastise these raiders. How effective these campaigns really were is debatable. If the Spanish found anyone, it was highly likely not to be the group that had raided the Spanish and instead an unrelated band. And this attacking a group that's unrelated to the group you're actually looking for will cause that group or their friends to now want to retaliate against you in turn, which kind of creates this cycle with the interactions between the Spanish and the Navajo. One side does a raid or something, and then the other side responds in kind, but it doesn't necessarily attack the group that originally wronged them. The Navajo had a better idea of the land and terrain and could more easily disappear, and a different band may not know what so-and-so is up to. You attack them, they want to retaliate in kind, which then now you send the troops out again, and you get kind of stuck in this cycle of overall, though all this kind of these punitive campaigns really didn't do much to effectively stop the Navajo from their raiding. Really all it did was grow the animosity between both sides. And like most groups of people, the Diné are not a monolith, and not all of the Navajo bands were enemies of the Spanish, nor were all their interactions hostile. Some bands would ally with the Spanish to get an upper hand on other rival bands of theirs. Sometimes the Spanish, Navajo, or Puebloans would organize trade expeditions into the other's lands. So the raiding was really just kind of one part of a much more complicated web of interactions that bound all these different groups of people together. I mean, we're talking about a large number of fairly autonomous groups that are all pretty much doing their own thing. Not all of them are going to fall perfectly in line with we're enemies of the Spanish or we're friends of the Spanish. However, starting kind of in the 1700s, you see a transformation of the Navajo. Now that they had livestock and horses, they would begin to change from an occasional nuisance on the Spanish fringe into a major regional player on the southwest. This influence would also make them a major thorn in the Spanish's side. Despite their best efforts, the Spanish would never really be successful in finding a lasting resolution with the Navajo, be it just to end the raiding or for a more lasting peace. We'll talk a lot more about the Comanches in future episodes, but if we kind of compare the two, the Spanish basically bribed the Comanches into leaving them alone in New Mexico and Texas. And like I said, we'll get much more into the weeds of this. And that never really seemed to work with the Navajo. And that may be because the Navajo were less centralized as a group. And so they were much more independent. So you make a treaty with one band or several bands, but the other bands over here really don't care what treaties you have with them. Doesn't really seem like there was a centralized organ to kind of get all of these people in the same direction, which again, they weren't really a united front, so it wouldn't make sense for them to do so. A lot of times, a part of this failure to create a lasting peace is usually is cited as the failure of the Spanish to be able to get enough leverage over the Navajos to entice them to actually centralize in the point. This is the person who's going to be doing diplomacy with the Spanish on our behalf, and whatever treaties we come up with, we will all honor as a group or break as a group. Often, the Comanches are used as a comparison for this, where the traditional narrative is the Spanish get enough economic leverage over them that they can kind of throw their weight around and say, okay, you're going to appoint someone who can make peace or treaties on behalf of all of you. And the Comanches, due to the need for Spanish goods, are kind of forced to comply. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues with that kind of portrayal later, but that's kind of usually the failure of the Spanish, the cited failure of the Spanish with the Navajo. Does that really reflect reality is kind of a different story. really what happened is the Spanish failed to understand the Navajo at a deep enough level to actually be able to come up with an effective solution. They and later groups will be so focused on getting the Navajo to, kind of centralize into one large group. Yeah, you can have your little groups within that, but there's a central leader who does all the treaty making. And that's always the Spanish and later American insistence, is that this is how it will be organized for diplomatic purposes. When probably had they focused more on divide and conquer, divide and rule, these bands are all independent, so we'll make deals with each bands and kind of use that to gain leverage over individual bands. That probably would have worked a lot better for the Spanish. And that came down to kind of just a failure of the Spanish worldview and failure of how the Spanish went about diplomacy with indigenous nations in North America, especially, because we'll see the same thing when we deal with the Comanches. That's always a very big Spanish insistence, is that they all pretty much form one nation, that nation in quotes here, that the Spanish can treat with. Overall, the Navajo will become a major player, and it starts here in the 1700s. While they're not quite finished there yet with that evolution, we'll see kind of interspersed throughout the main narrative them kind of forming that evolution from fringe of the Spanish Empire to major thorn in the side of the non-nomadic peoples of the Southwest. I think this is kind of where we'll wrap up for now, as the Navajo aren't really the major indigenous nation that the Spanish will be dealing with and reacting to in the 1700s. But I thought this was a good place to start introducing them. As we progress, we'll be talking about them more and more.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.